So he came backstage at the high school auditorium shortly before we both went on to Lip Sync Records.
The clean-cut star who held back a bombshell for 70 years. What if the king of rock and roll had a secret, and the only person who knew the truth kept it hidden for decades? Pat Boone wasn't just a 1950s heartthrob with slick-back hair and a choir boy's smile. Behind the angelic image and smooth crooning voice, he was sitting on one of the biggest secrets in American music history. A secret involving Elvis Presley himself. You see, while America thought it had two opposing stars, Elvis, the bad boy, and Boone, the church kid, the truth was far more twisted. The media wanted a rivalry. They built it, sold it, and made millions off it. But Boone? He was watching Elvis spiral behind closed doors, witnessing raw, fragile moments the world never saw. And now, 91 years old, nothing to lose, legacy secure, he's finally talking. And what he reveals, it's not what you'd expect from someone who made his career off purity and gospel songs. It's personal, it's painful, and it shatters everything you thought you knew about the king of rock. Elvis versus Pat Boone, the rivalry that was never real, and the private truth that was far more heartbreaking. The cameras showed Elvis shaking his hips. What they didn't show, a late-night phone call with Pat Boone where the king cried about being lost. In the 1950s, America was obsessed. Two young stars, two paths. Elvis, wild, electric, rebellious. Pat, calm, clean, righteous. But here's the twist. They weren't enemies. In fact, Boone says the feud was a lie created by Hollywood execs and newspapers to drive headlines. Behind the scenes, there were no insults, no ego battles. Instead, there were quiet conversations, stolen moments backstage, and even shared fears. Boone now admits that Elvis trusted him, not as a competitor, but as someone who understood what it meant to be famous and lonely. There were times when Elvis would call him in the middle of the night just to talk. And one thing Pat Boone will never forget. Elvis once told me, he says, "I've got everything, but I don't know who I am anymore." That's the side of Elvis no one reported on. And it's the one that haunted Boone for decades. Because while the world cheered as Elvis rocked and rolled, Boone saw a man slipping into darkness, craving peace, and being consumed by fame. And now, Boone is finally telling us what he saw, not as a rival, but as the only man who truly understood the weight Elvis was carrying.
A manufactured rivalry. A hidden bond. The headlines screamed war. But behind the curtains, it was something else entirely. Throughout the 1950s and beyond, tabloids had a field day pitting Pat Boone and Elvis Presley against each other. Clean versus dangerous. Christian versus controversial. It was the ultimate cultural face-off, and the press milked every drop. But Boone just broke the silence. And according to him, the rivalry was mostly fiction. They needed a narrative, he says. And what better than the saint versus the sinner? But the truth? There was no personal vendetta. What there was quiet admiration, subtle understanding, and a private connection nobody ever reported. Boone now admits he respected Elvis deeply. Not just for the music, but for the pain behind the voice. He recognized early on that Elvis wasn't just an entertainer, he was a wounded genius, trying to survive the storm of his own fame. He had a magnetism that couldn't be explained, Boone confesses. But offstage, he looked tired, worn, like a man fighting battles no one could see. This wasn't rivalry. It was a tragedy unfolding in real time. And Boone, stuck in a role he never asked for, watched as the man America turned into a god slowly crumbled under the pressure. The late-night calls that changed everything. The world saw a legend. Pat Boone saw a man unraveling at 2 a.m. When Elvis Presley couldn't sleep, when the crowds had gone home, the stage lights turned off, and the silence became too loud, He'd sometimes reach out to someone he trusted. That person? Pat Boone. Boone says those calls were never long, never planned, but they were unforgettable. He'd talk about his fears, his soul. Sometimes he didn't even say much, just silence on the line, Boone reveals. And in those rare, unfiltered moments, Boone realized something. Elvis didn't want to be a star. He wanted to be saved. While the rest of the world saw rhinestones, screaming fans, and gold records, Boone saw a man quietly pleading for peace. He told me once, "I don't think anyone sees the real me," and I didn't know what to say, because he was right. Boone believes those moments weren't just casual chats. They were cries for help. And now, decades later, he carries the guilt of not doing more. Maybe if I'd reached out harder, maybe if I'd pushed back against the image, things could have been different, he says, his voice trembling. Because while Elvis was swallowed whole by fame, Pat Boone stood frozen, watching a friend disappear behind the...
When Pat Boone showed up in black leather covering heavy metal hits, people thought he lost his mind. But there was something deeper going on. In the late 1990s, the world did a double take. Pat Boone, the gospel-singing, Bible-quoting, all-American sweetheart, walked onto the American Music Awards stage dressed in head-to-toe black leather. He wasn't there to preach. He was there to promote an album that no one could have predicted. In a metal mood, no more Mr. Nice Guy. That's right, heavy metal covers sung by the cleanest man in show business. Was it a joke? A publicity stunt? Some critics laughed. Fans were confused. But if you ask Pat now, it was none of that. It was a tribute to boldness, to risk, to Elvis, he says. Because Pat Boone saw something in the way Elvis threw himself into his music, even when it pushed boundaries, ruffled feathers, or cost him dearly. That album was Boone's way of saying, "I get it now." It took me years to understand what Elvis was chasing. That need to evolve, to push, to scream into the void just to feel alive. That was him. But it's part of me, too. And maybe, just maybe, dressing in leather and singing Alice Cooper was Boone's late career rebellion. A nod to the friend he lost, and the risks he never took. It wasn't just about metal. It was about finally embracing the chaos he spent his whole life avoiding. He had 50 million records sold, 2,600 songs, and the longest chart run of the 20th century, and yet, he was always seen as second to Elvis. Let's talk facts. Not rumors, not opinions. Pure, historic dominance. Pat Boone sold over 50 million records. He recorded more than 2,600 songs. He had 38 top 40 hits with 6 #1 singles. And for an almost unbelievable stretch of 220 consecutive weeks, he had at least one song on the US charts. That's more than 4 years straight. No breaks, no drops, no fade-outs. Just constant, consistent domination of American airwaves. And yet, he was rarely called iconic. Why? Because he wasn't dangerous. He wasn't sexy. He wasn't Elvis. Boone played by the rules, stayed clean, sang about love and God while others sang about lust and rebellion. I wasn't flashy, he admits, but I was there, week after week, year after year. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy in Boone's legacy. He outlasted almost everyone, but never got the credit for it. Because in the story of American rock and roll, scandal writes better headlines than stability. They saw me as the safe one, Boone said.
When the spotlight dimmed and the screams faded, Pat Boone was still there, watching the Kings fall from the quiet corners no one else noticed.
In the end, Pat Boone wasn't Elvis's competitor. He was his mirror, his witness, the only man from that era still standing and still speaking with heartbreaking honesty. At 91, Boone isn't chasing relevance, he's chasing closure. I saw his pain, he says. I just didn't speak up soon enough. He doesn't offer excuses, he doesn't claim he could have saved Elvis, but there's a quiet ache in his voice, a man who understood the cost of fame too late. And for the first time in his life, Boone isn't just singing, he's confessing. Elvis wasn't a cautionary tale, he was a soul screaming to be understood. And Boone, he's finally ready to make sure that scream is heard. This isn't just about Elvis, it's about what fame hides, what it destroys, and what it leaves behind. Pat Boone's story isn't flashy. It isn't filled with arrests or addictions or tabloid meltdowns. It's filled with longevity, consistency, integrity, but also silence. For decades, he kept the emotional truths to himself, until now. He's showing us that the safest man in music had front row seats to one of the greatest collapses in pop culture history. And he's not bitter. He had a beautiful heart, Boone says. I wish more people had seen that. So when you think of Pat Boone now, don't just think of the suits and the smiles. Think of a man who stood beside greatness, saw it unravel, and chose to finally speak. Not for clout, not for fame, but because the truth deserved to be heard before it died with him. This isn't just Elvis's story, he says. It's mine too. And now, it's ours. If this side of Elvis and Pat Boone blew your mind, wait till you hear the next secret from this forgotten golden age of music. Like, subscribe, and stick around. Because the real stories, the ones they buried under the spotlight, we're just getting started.